So, right now, there are a couple things in the news that I find really, 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 really interesting. One is the Syrian refugee issues in Europe,
Yes.
and then the other is what's been going on with ISIS and the PKK over in Turkey and Iraq.
All right, my news on that one's a little dated. I mean, I don't know anything that's happened in the last couple of weeks, but what happened?
Alrighty, so I'll bring you up on the second one when we get there. So let's talk about the Syrian refugee thing. So, for starters, I just want to try and clarify what exactly's been going on. So, Syria right now are they in the middle of a civil war, or why are these people fleeing Syria in such droves?
Yeah, the Civil War's been going for, I think, 5 years, or maybe even more. It's part of the Arab Spring. And so you had a bunch of Sunni Muslims in Syria rise up against Bashar Assad, who is the president and is an Alawite. Somehow it's related to Shia Islam. But at any rate, they've just been fighting ever since. Neither side is strong enough to beat the other. And then you have a whole bunch of proxy fighters coming in from all over the Muslim world as well. And it's displaced pretty much everybody in Syria. And that's why they're trying to get out.
So, has it just gotten worse lately, or why is there such a large influx of people right now?
That's a good question, and I can't really answer it because, I mean, they've always had refugees. And not all of the refugees are Syrian. Quite a few of the migrants that Europe's dealing with right now come from Sudan, which is having a continued civil war again. I think it's in South Sudan, actually. I think it's the world's newest country. But anyways, they're already back to civil war. But yeah, I don't really know what has happened in Syria that's increased the pressure on the civilians to leave. Probably, I mean, think about it. You've been in a country that's been at war for that long. Eventually, it's going to get to you. There's probably no part of the country now that hasn't been blown up.
For whatever reason that they're getting out of there in such large numbers, right now the entire European Union is having a lot of trouble dealing with them. The biggest problem right now is that basically all of these Syrian refugees want to go to Germany and the UK, and Germany and the UK don't want to have to deal with all of them or can't handle all of them. And so they've tried to start setting up these borders, letting them in at a rate that these countries can handle. Well, that's not quick enough, so a lot of people are starting to enter these countries illegally. They're resorting to human trafficking, and to try and help with this, I guess the European Union is trying to get other countries to take some of the refugees, and the other countries are refusing, basically saying that they're too poor to be able to afford to do anything about it. And so that's just making the situation even more dire. And now we're having people shown up being killed by these human trafficking rings, and the whole thing is just becoming a bigger and bigger mess. And unless somebody much smarter than me has a solution, I haven't heard anybody talking about how to resolve it.
Well, and this is at its core an intractable problem because the more refugees that you take, the more that are going to come. Okay, so essentially what it is you have people fleeing their countries because of the situation, whether it's economic or political, and going to richer countries. The problem with that, and something that the open borders crowd doesn't seem to understand, is that you cannot immigrate away, or you cannot destroy poverty via immigration. Just like you cannot increase wages by sending everybody to college. Because there is a set limit. It's a structural limit on what a country can do. And so all of these immigrants go into these first world countries. There aren't enough jobs for them. There's not enough money to be paying for their welfare benefits. At some point, it's going to stop. And the bigger problem is that it's racially transforming these countries in a way that's not exactly healthy. I mean, just look at all those second and third generation Muslim children of immigrants in Europe who have flown down to Iraq to fight for ISIS. I mean, that's a big problem. Assimilation isn't working, and all these problems are a result of some really stupid thinking after World War II.
I know that the European Union kind of has this open borders thing because they're kind of trying to emulate the open borders with states in the United States as far as interstate commerce and stuff like that is going. But why do they have open borders, or why would they be even offering amnesty to all these immigrants and refugees when in Germany over the past few years they've basically gotten about 800,000 refugees living in their country now? And that just seems like that's an extreme burden. I would just wonder, why would those countries even be open to that in the first place? What advantage is it? Is it just a humanitarian thing, or is there some sort of economic or political advantage here?
Well, I think mostly it is a humanitarian thing. I mean, Europeans are, how do you want to call it? I know that Mark Steins referred to it as what's going on in Europe as the death cult, which is militant Islam meets the suicide cult, which is European leftism. I mean, because essentially they are not at all concerned with economic balance or their own country's well-being. Instead, it's all about moral preening. And in this case, what could be more moral than letting in asylum seekers coming from a country where everyone's getting shot? And you have to agree with them. Just right before we started this podcast, I saw that headline about those two Syrian toddlers that they found who had drowned trying to cross from Turkey into Greece. And I mean, that's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
But the unfortunate thing is that, you got to use your head with these things instead of your heart, because it can't go on forever. The more people who are granted asylum, the more people are going to come. And it's human nature. I mean, why wouldn't you try to make a better life for yourself? But really, in the long run, what would be better would be to stabilize the situation in those countries in the first place, because there is a definite limit on the amount of migrants that the first world can handle.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just look at California. Because I like that you bring up the Schengen Agreement, which essentially got rid of borders in continental Europe with what goes on in the United States. Because essentially, places that are poorly governed are losing population. So people are fleeing California in droves at the moment because they're seeking economic opportunity. And for whatever reason, it seems somewhat obvious to me, but we could just say for whatever reason, they're not finding that economic opportunity in California. The problem, though, is that they're bringing their expectations with them. I mean, a great example is here in Colorado. Colorado used to be a typical Western conservative state.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go anywhere outside of Boulder and Denver and Fort Collins and up there, you'll still see a lot of that. But now we've had so many people move in from California and other places that the character of the state has changed. I mean, that's why you have legal marijuana and a bunch of other really goofy policies. And the rest of the state hates it. It feels like, our identity has been stolen from us. I mean, I can't remember what the percentage is, but somebody told me that I think it's around 60% of Colorado's population is non-native.
Really? Wow. Because I know I've heard a lot of people talking about that, the Californians being a big issue throughout the Mountain West region. Texas is another one that's getting hit really hard with the Californian migration. Arizona, Utah a little bit, though not nearly as much. And from hearing people who are native to those states talking about how this influx of Californians are changing the landscape, they all sound frustrated by it. Especially when it comes to driving.
Well, and the problem in a democracy is that you have rule by the majority. And so once it flips, essentially you have it's a form of tyranny. Because your state has now been taken over by people who aren't from there, who have different beliefs, different priorities, different values than yours. And so imagine that on a national level. How does it feel when the whole purpose of the nation state is to give a particular people a political voice, right? And then you're taking it away from them by allowing a bunch of migrants to move in and fundamentally transform the character of the nation state. Those two things are incompatible. And that's when I said that Europe made some stupid decisions after World War II, that's exactly the one that they made. They decided that nationalism was some great evil, and the only way to get rid of it was to destroy the national character of the state.
Along, a similar kind of topic again in the Middle East is, of course, ISIS, everyone's favorite so-called Islamic state. And recently, the Turkish government had said that they were going to actually start fighting ISIS in Iraq and trying to take back some of the land that they took. And so they were calling a bunch of countries to come join them in their fight, which no one really did because as soon as they got into Iraq, they changed their focus from ISIS to the Turkish rebel group, the PKK, who are fighting to try and democratize and liberalize, I think, Turkey. But they call themselves the Kurds? Is that just the name of a tribe from Turkey?
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit.
Uh-huh.
We'll start from first principles. So yeah, the Kurds are an ethnic group that has been living in the Middle East for a very, very long time. They're different than the Arabs. Actually, back in Byzantine times, the Kurds were kind of the shock troops of the Arab and Turkish armies. But at any rate, they speak a different language. They're culturally distinct from the Arabs, but they have no state.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, they live in Turkey and in Iraq and in Syria.
Okay.
And they want a state because that's what nationalism is, right? It's the idea of self-determination. But at any rate, the principle of this word is that, people should have the right to declare their own political bonds, right? It's an anti-imperial thing.
Okay.
But at any rate, so that's what the Kurds want. The PKK actually is a Marxist group that has been a terrorist group too.
Right. Yes, they're far left.
Right, and they've been operating there for decades, killing civilians. I mean, they're very active in Turkey as far as trying to destabilize the government. And I think they're on our list of terrorist organizations. But essentially, what's going on with Turkey is that the United States has been leaning on them to do our dirty work. Because under the Obama administration, we want the Islamic State to disappear, but we don't want to do anything about it. Because he took the troops out of Iraq, right?
Right.
He's an anti-war president. The problem with the Turks, though, is that they are perfectly happy to have ISIS next door. Because ISIS isn't bothering them. It's beating up on their enemies, the Kurds, and it's beating up on their enemies, the Syrians. Because you got to remember that a lot of this analysis of the Muslim conflict right now is between the Sunnis and the Shia.
Right, yes.
And so in a lot of ways, the Sunni monarchies and other governments are more than happy to see ISIS fighting Iran and taking on their other enemies by proxy. And so, I mean, it's kind of a complicated situation down there, but it is kind of despicable because the Kurds are essentially the only ones whose interests align with ours, and we're not doing anything to help them because that makes Turkey mad, and we've decided that keeping Turkey happy is worth the limitations on our strategic vision.
Well, and I can completely understand that because at least a lot of people's analysis of the current state of affairs in the Middle East has been that America's continued presence there only deepens the problems, and that ultimately these people need to figure out their own jam. They need to figure out their own way to resolving the problems, to achieving peace. Which, it may take a long time, but it seems pretty clear that American intervention is not working. That is not the solution.
I couldn't disagree more with that, though, because these people have been hating each other and killing each other for thousands of years. The only thing that keeps them from doing that is when you have some strong outside imperial power forcing them to get along. And so, I mean, it kind of depends on what your goals are. I mean, we just talked about the Syria migration crisis and all those people who are dying, and I mean, that is a problem. And I mentioned that the solution is not so much to take all of them in, it's to try and fix the underlying problem so that they'll want to stay home. Because isn't that what we all want, right? Shouldn't that be a worthy goal? But sometimes to do that, you've got to flex your muscles and project power. And I think that when the United States was in Iraq, things were better than they'd ever been. People tend to forget because of how the war is perceived that under Saddam, you had countless atrocities. People were dying all over the place. And when we first came in, a lot of people were happy to have the Americans there, and then Al-Qaeda got involved, and then just like with ISIS right now, you had a whole bunch of foreign fighters coming in to fight us, because that's what they do. But we won the war. After the surge, things were quiet. Things were good. And then we threw it away. To say that things weren't good under America and that we need to mind our own business, I mean, you can make that argument, but I don't think that you can make that argument but then also be concerned about the humanitarian crisis. It's either one or the other.
Wasn't ISIS born of our occupation in Iraq? Wasn't that kind of what facilitated?
Our absence in Iraq, because we disappeared, and then they saw that the Iraqi army was corrupt and weak, and they filled that vacuum.
So it seems like, in your mind, then the solution is for us to take an imperialistic approach, where we basically go in and say, all right, you guys can't run your own country, we're going to have to run it for you.
Absolutely. If you look at the most well-off countries in the world, you'll see that they tend to have one thing in common, and that's that they were colonized by the British Empire. And there was a lot of good that was done by that. I mean, you have a whole bunch of Commonwealth countries that use the common law and follow British customs and speak English, and they benefit as a result of that. And so imperialism isn't all bad. You gotta throw out all that critical neo-colonial theory that's going on, that's so in vogue in leftist circles, and you need to evaluate it fairly. And you'll see that, I mean, there's good and bad. It's like, well, look at Rome, right? One of the original imperial powers. Was Rome's rule bloody and were there problems? Yes. But they also had the Pax Romana. Without Rome there to keep everybody together, they were constantly killing each other and stealing each other's stuff, because that's the default human behavior. So just because you have some strong power coming in to keep the peace doesn't necessarily mean that people are being oppressed. And I think if you were to go down to the Middle East, go back to Iraq and ask people who are living under the Islamic State which they would prefer, they would welcome us back with open arms.
For a minute.
Well, we weren't hanging people from lampposts and stealing children and women.
Yeah, but as soon as we do our job, as soon as we come in and clean house, they're going to immediately want us to leave again. I mean, that's what you saw happen with all of the American colonies after World War II. You know, they were happy to have America there during the war because
Yeah.
they couldn't defend themselves, probably in part because they were American colonies and we wouldn't let them defend themselves. But then, as soon as the war was over, they're like, okay, you guys can go now. We've got things covered. We can handle things
I
here.
believe you are vaguely referencing the Philippines, and I would just note that they are now begging us to come back.
Well, sort of, but I'm talking about the Philippines and other countries that, well, I mean, like even like Panama, and then like Hong Kong wanted British rule out of there, and then they finally got it back in 1999. You know, stuff like that. Like, people want to be able to govern themselves.
Well, actually, the issue in Hong Kong is that when Britain originally took the city, there was like I think it was a 99-year lease.
Yes.
And so, the people of Hong Kong did not want the British to leave. It was a big point of contention, but the British said, we're not going to do anything. We can't do anything.
Really? I remember there being big celebrations when Britain finally left.
Some people might have celebrated, but I mean, at least the sources that I read at the time, there was a lot of concern, because why would you want to join communist China?
Yeah.
I mean, you're Hong Kong. You do what you want.
Ideally.
And I mean, it has not been a pretty assimilation. I mean, there's been protests in the last few years as Beijing has tried to crack down on the political freedom that the people in Hong Kong had taken for granted.
China's an interesting case. I mean, if I knew more about it, I'd love to talk about it right now, but all I know is that in the news recently, people realize that you can't sustain an economy purely on economic growth, that eventually that growth will falter, and because this growth is faltering a lot sooner than anticipated, everything's starting to go down the drain a bit.
Yeah, imagine that, Bryson. Something that can't go on forever won't.
It's pretty amazing. No one saw this coming. Absolutely no one ever saw this coming.
The smart people did. The journalists are the ones who did. They're the ones who are dumbfounded. How could this possibly be happening?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how China will have to react to this, because basically they were riding on the wave of all this free goodwill, and now that that's gone, they have to start being very serious about infrastructure and business and all the things that'll allow them to sustain this way of life that they've become accustomed to. That's clearly, the wrinkles are starting to show, and they have to figure out how they're going to handle the aging process.
Right. And it's not going to be pretty, is my guess.
It's possible. I mean, you have a really weird country that's extremely left-wing, but is also extremely capitalist-driven because the corporations over there hold a tremendous amount of power. They make the United States look ridiculously sane, but it seems like those two philosophies are contradictory to each other, so...
And Bryson, the reason that you think that is because you were very poorly taught. The idea that right-wing and left-wing, I mean, that was invented by Joseph Stalin to distinguish himself from Hitler.
Really?
Because it has absolutely no bearing on what actually is at issue here. So, for example, in China, yeah, they've embraced capitalism, but they really haven't. They've actually embraced the National Socialist model that the Nazis were using. It's called corporatism, where essentially the state gives special favors to these giant companies, and these giant companies have to do what the state tells them, right? They've been subjected to political discipline. It is not at all a real capitalist society because individuals are not free to make their own choices. You can't go and start a business in China. You can't just start making money. You got to do exactly what you're told. And, it's also a dictatorship, a totalitarian society.
Well, like, I would say, from what I've seen on the news and from even reports of people in the public relations world, it seems like the corporations are the ones that hold the power rather than the state over the corporations. It's the other way around, that the corporations are utilizing the state for their own gains.
That's what people think?
I've heard it said.
No way, no way. Because essentially, they're all it's the ruling class. They're the same people. You've got the party people, and then you've got the leaders of the corporations. But, I mean, they are subject to party discipline. It's cronyism. You got the same thing here in America, just to a different extent. It's not a closed club, because the politicians don't yet have the power to dictate outcomes. They do sometimes.
Yeah. Well, either way, just to kind of go back to what we had been talking about many minutes ago, I think it's really interesting that the PKK is actually starting to fight ISIS, that they have drummed up enough support and have actually started to take strategic stances against ISIS. And I'm curious to see if the United States will intervene because, like you said, even though the United States recognizes them as a terrorist organization, that, and the European Union does as well, in both cases, they're kind of loosely defined as a terrorist organization because I would assume it's because in both cases we kind of want their goals to succeed. We just don't like the way they're doing them.
I mean, there's a whole lot more to the Kurds than the PKK. That's just one group among many. Because there are plenty Kurdish groups that we work with very closely.
But are they as left wing as the PKK? Because the PKK wants gender equality. I mean, they've got like 17,000 of their troops are women, which is kind of astonishing to see that in the Middle East when the stereotype is much the opposite.
I mean, you got all sorts of groups, but a lot of them are leftist. But they work together. That's the thing. I mean, the Kurdish militia, the Peshmerga. I mean, as far as I understand, that's a unified front. And actually, you have quite a few Americans and Britons who are sneaking over there to fight with them. And the Kurds have taken it upon themselves to protect the Christians and Yazidis who are within their jurisdiction, which is a huge plus as far as we're concerned. But like I said, the thing that's going to keep us from helping the Kurds is we don't want to offend Turkey. And there are plenty of people who say, forget Turkey, because Turkey has not done anything to help us out in a long time. And Erdogan, I mean, he's a dictator in training.
Who is Erdogan?
That's the Turkish president.
Okay.
Because he's essentially trying to destroy the secular nature of Turkey and make it an Islamist society. I think he has a famous quote about democracy. He says, it's great. It's like getting on the bus, and then when you're done, you get off the bus.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard that before, but... So, going back to the central issue with ISIS, so I can understand your point that you think that American intervention basically would be the best thing to do in the Middle East to try and help create stability. But do you think that American intervention in the Middle East would be too irresponsible for us to go with now, especially because of increasing debt and everything like that? Or do you think that there is a strong enough vested interest that it's worth it for us to intervene?
I think it would be worth it to intervene on a limited scale.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, ISIS is a cancer and it needs to be stopped. The reason that it needs to be stopped is because the more successful that it seems, the more of a propaganda victory it is to other extremists. I mean, it's like a row of dominoes. And I think the rest of the Middle East gets it. Remember, it wasn't that long ago that Saudi Arabia and Egypt were taking action against ISIS. And so, I mean, I think that if we were smart about how we did it, it wouldn't be too hard. But I mean, those kinds of considerations, it's hard for me to make. My particular concern is I don't like the fact that Middle Eastern Christianity is essentially being extinguished at the moment.
Right.
My proposal would be that we would find our natural allies in the region, which would be the Christians, which would be the Kurds, and then we find ways to protect them and then help them assert themselves. And then you can build on that, because there are plenty of people in Iraq who do not want to live under the Islamic State. And if push comes to shove, they're going to support us. And that is the important thing. You just have to go about it intelligently.
So, right now, the American policy in the Middle East, especially with regards to ISIS, is to basically just keep using Predator drones. We're concerned with containment, but ultimately we want to let the people in the region actually do the dirty work, as you said. But we are supporting them with containment strategies and stuff like that. And you said you want intervention, but limited intervention. So I assume you want something a little bit more than what we're doing right now, but maybe a little bit less than an all-out war, like when we declared war with Iraq?
I mean, I'm not privy to the kind of information that a decision maker would need, but I think that there's much to be said for the go big or go home approach. And I would just note that this is something that Walter Russell Mead pointed out when the Syria civil war was going hot, and remember when Obama decided not to intervene this last time. We're doing nobody any favors by mildly helping one side. Because, I mean, essentially, we've created the perfect conditions for an interminable conflict. No side can beat the other side, which means it's going to go on forever and everyone's going to die. It would almost be better off if one side just won. By keeping it going, you just ensure that it's going to be as ferocious as possible. And, I mean, Syria at this point is never going to recover. I think that, I can't remember what the stats are, but a massive amount of its population has already fled. And they're not coming back.
I actually heard some sort of business guy from the U.S. actually suggest that maybe we should create a new country for all these refugees. And all I can think is, well, it'd be nice to have yet another Israel.
Why not? Lebanon used to be the Christian version of Israel because France created it like that. But then we abandoned them, and, the one side had more guns than the other. Now all the Lebanese Christians live in the West because they immigrated because they were getting killed.
But where would we put them?
Put them back.
In Syria? And turn Syria into a refugee nation?
Yeah, here's what I would do. The first thing that I would do is I would send a massive force to Palmyra, and I would clear them out before they destroy that beautiful city, and then you just start growing from there. It wouldn't be that hard. If there's anything, we've been fighting in Iraq for so long, we've become subject matter experts.
I think the ultimate thing, though, is that at some point, this refugee problem, this ISIS problem, everything's going to be such a economic strain on everyone else in the world that their problem is going to become our problem.
Right, I mean, ISIS is in control of oil fields. That should be a problem. Things were so much better in the Middle East when Bush left office, and it's just gotten really bad since. Iran was always a problem, but now we can't control them at all. We can't control anybody, and our allies hate us because we won't help them.